My name's Tyler. I'm a postdoc at the Miller Lab down in UC Santa Barbara. Represent. Yeah, I took a brief hiatus from memory research in graduate school, so it's nice to be back among friends. So before I begin, I just have to thank my lab and Miguel Eckstein's lab as well. These people did all the hard work of actually running the study and collecting the data before I got to UCSB, and then I got to do the fun part of just analyzing it, so that was really nice. So before we begin, just a quick kind of overview of the way we're thinking about this. So I would like to think that in most situations, the decisions that we make in life are based on evidence, maybe. Could be contentious, but as we know, evidence can be ambiguous or uncertain. And what we end up needing to do is find a way of weighing this information against some threshold in order to act. So we typically call this a decision criterion. And what we're trying to do is see if we can find a stable neural representation of these sorts of decision processes across different decision-making tasks. This is kind of a rhetorical question. The answer is obviously like, yeah, totally, we can do this. That's why I'm here. Or at least we think, and I'm going to show you guys some data. So here's the kind of general plan. Go over very quickly some background information. I'll talk about the task and the machine learning model that we use, some preliminary findings, and then just kind of where I think we could potentially go from here. All right, so let's begin. All right, so we like to model memory as a decision-making process. So let's say that I'm just kind of, walking along, and I see a face that looks familiar in the distance.
That's me.
If I'm on campus at UCSB and I see this face, I might, feel more inclined to be like, oh, well, this is totally Evan. Like, contextually, it makes sense that this would be somebody that I know. Maybe I'll go up and approach him and say hi, and like, why the hell do you have this TMS coil strapped to your head? Versus, if I'm in frigid New York City in the winter and I see a face that looks familiar, I'd be, probably a lot more conservative in my decision criterion. I'd be a lot less likely to approach this crazy person and, say hi. I'd probably stay on the opposite side of the street and let them amble on. So what we're discussing here is essentially a kind of signal detection account of memory. So essentially the idea is that in signal detection theory, in order to make optimal decisions, you need both kind of the ability to discriminate signal from noise, so D prime, and you need an appropriately biased criterion. So it could be either a little bit more liberal or a little bit more conservative depending on the context that you're in. There's some great behavioral evidence from Justin Kantner showing that kind of an individual's criterion placement seems to be kind of a stable internal trait. So both over time, criterion placement tends to be stable, and across different stimulus types in memory studies, in recognition memory. We have some evidence from neuroimaging, similarly, with different types of stimuli, showing that the successful retrieval effect, so hits versus correct rejections, has a pretty similar kind of general pattern of activity, depending on whether you're remembering words or doing recognition memory for faces. Quick caveat, this is particularly when you have a conservative decision criterion, and the reason for this is that in this study, there was pretty much no activation in a liberal criterion. So here it seems to be very much driven by the conservativeness of your criterion, but the point remains the same. All right, so in this study, we're kind of asking people to make both memorial and perceptual decisions. So participants in the scanner go through 8 test runs, and in each run, they see a series of visual scenes appear one at a time on the screen in the scanner. And during the memory task, they're just asked to discriminate, is the picture that you're currently seeing part of a set that you previously studied in the beginning? During the perception task, they're just making a target present absent judgment. So is there a person in this picture? We manipulate evidence, so D prime across low or moderate D prime. So in the memory task, this just involves pictures that were repeatedly presented during encoding. In the perception task, it's basically just kind of pictures that had easier or harder targets to detect, and these were rated independently. And then we also manipulate criterion placement. So we try to get people to be liberal or conservative. So in liberal blocks, the way that we do this, we use kind of the most classic motivator, money. So we tell people that we'll reward you for every correct response you make. But in order to get people liberal, we tell them, all right, in this set of trials, we're going to take money away from you every time you get a miss. So every time you fail to identify something you previously studied. To get them to be conservative, we tell them, we're going to take money away from you every time you false alarm. So every time you say that you've previously encountered something that you actually haven't. So we have kind of this 2x2x2 design, and in each run, they kind of do mini blocks of each cell in this design. So we compute hit versus correct rejection images, so they do this in the scanner. Hit versus correct rejection contrasts for each cell, so we have 8 images per participant. And we do some machine learning. So are you guys ready for some math?
Yeah.
Just kidding. I wouldn't do that. It's too late in the day for this. Well, we'll take it a little bit easier. So the general idea, so we use something called sparse Bayesian multitask multi-kernel learning. Ooh, fancy, right? It's a mouthful. So the general idea is that first we parcellate the brain. So we use the 400 region Schaefer atlas that was just released in cerebral cortex earlier this year. So we have 400 regions of interest that we cut up every contrast image, hit versus correct rejection, according to. We build a linear kernel for every region and every task. So for each cell in that design. And these are, centered according to training data, unit normalized, all that fun stuff. And then we train a model to either predict the kind of criterion placement, so whether they're liberal or conservative, or whether they're seeing stimuli that have, or that should have, either low or moderate decision evidence. So we're trying to discriminate between either liberal or conservative criterion, or low and moderate D prime. And then I'll also say that, we have, so say for example, when we're discriminating between liberal and conservative criterion, we have kind of 2 simultaneous sets of kernels, so one for the low condition, one for the moderate condition. So this approach lets us kind of learn a shared latent feature representation between these 2 kind of different conditions in our task. Hopefully should improve our ability to predict. So we train the model, and then we test on the left out task. So we train on the memory task, we see if we can predict the perception task, and vice versa. Train on the perception task, see if we can predict the memory task. All right, so how do we do? What did we find? Just as a quick manipulation check, looking at D prime. So we have liberal conditions or trials on the top, conservative on the bottom. There's a lot of inter-individual variability, all these little raindrops here. But we see that, in fact, in the low D prime condition, D prime is, in fact, significantly lower than it is in the moderate D prime condition for memory and perception. And then same thing for criterion placement. So when we have a liberal condition, we have we have a negative criterion value on average versus conservative, we have a positive criterion value on average. So people do seem to be kind of adapting the kind of level of cautiousness that we try to induce by telling them, we're going to give you money or we're going to take it away from you. People respond to that really well. And then just looking at kind of cross-task associations, if we look at D prime, so memory on the x-axis, perception on the y-axis, here we collapse across liberal and conservative. I promise you that if I actually divided this up, it looks exactly the same. So totally flat slope, so there's no relationship in your ability to discriminate signal from noise, targets from non-targets, across the 2 tasks, either in the moderate D prime or the low D prime condition. So there's no relationship between those, but when we look at criterion, so here we're actually using something, a composite measure called criterion shifting, so it's the difference between conservative and liberal criterion. Also, I promise you that if I divided this up into individual cells, it looks exactly the same. We have super strong associations between the memory and the perception tasks. So again, this seems to be kind of a stable behavioral trait for individuals across, different conditions of, sensitivity to the information that you're being given, and you know, the actual strength of evidence itself. So there's strong cross-task stability. So this is nice. Very quickly, looking at our machine learning model. So here, this is just a composite map, weight map. So we basically take our weights that are learned for the liberal and conservative tasks and the memory and the perception tasks. We project those back into the original space of the brain, because remember we kind of compressed things into kernels before, and then we just averaged across memory and perception and weighted them by low and moderate D prime, and we get something that looks like this. So hot colors indicate voxels that push the model more towards predicting conservative criterion placement. Cool colors are voxels that push the model more towards predicting liberal criterion placement. I actually probably should have put a picture up of the univariate results just so you can see, but there's really nice overlap in regions that have really heavy weight for, you know, predicting conservative criterion. So when you're really monitoring the decision evidence that you have. This looks almost exactly the same if we break it up into low and moderate D prime. This is just an average, and yeah, we see that taking the balanced accuracy across both these tasks and these conditions of evidence strength, we predict with about 77% accuracy, significant with a non-parametric permutation test. So again, if we break it up, moderate D prime does a little bit better than low D prime, but they're both still statistically significant through permutation testing. And of course, if we try and predict the actual strength of evidence from a hit versus correct rejection map, it actually doesn't tell us anything about that. So predicting low and moderate D prime, so you know, presumably the strength of the memory trace that you have from a statistical map of hits and correct rejections, so when you're making successful memory decisions, or successful perceptual decisions, we actually can't predict that any better than chance. So the successful retrieval effect in this case doesn't actually tell us anything about the strength of decision evidence in either the memory or the perception tasks. So I think that's pretty neat. All right, so.
Very liberal threshold on that, though.
Thanks, Evan. All right, so with that, let's wrap up. Okay, so just a couple take-home points and some things I'm kind of excited about. So the big thing to get from this, hopefully, is that these multivariate patterns of successful decision-making related activity are conserved across these memory and perception tasks, so we can predict one from training a model on the other. And this is particularly when we consider the extent to which one is monitoring the decision evidence. So again, criterion placement. So it doesn't tell us anything about the strength of evidence itself. So those kind of low or moderate D prime manipulations. And again, you might think this is kind of weird because we're looking at a successful retrieval effect or a successful detection effect. And it doesn't tell us anything about, you know, the ostensible strength of the trace itself. So kind of where we'd like to go from here, so this is kind of at a group level. It's a little coarse. What we'd like to do is estimate these models on an individual subject level. And then I think kind of the interesting thing would be to see if, you know, the separability of these responses or the extent to which, you know, one task generalizes to another tracks with how well behavior is similar between the two tasks within participants. So this is kind of, you know, where we'd like to go from here, particularly something that we're hoping to present at SFN this year, if any of you guys are going to be there, so you can maybe come and see how we're doing. Hopefully I'll have good news for you. All right, well, with that, I'd like to thank you guys for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions you have. Thank you. Yes?
Sorry, I missed something. You built a model on an parcellation space.
Yes.
And then when you projected it back into the brain, that projection was in voxel space.
Yes.
And that seemed to be a smooth space that was not parcellated. How is that possible, given that the model was in parcel space and back to the brain?
Well, I mean, the data were smooth to begin with. So yeah, I mean, it's just a matter of projecting the kernel weights back onto the original data and then weighting those by So each voxel gets, again, another multiplication factor depending on the weight of the ROI, the particular region. And yeah, it just, the way that we map it just kind of looks interpolated across the voxels, but I mean, yeah, it is actually pretty smooth. You also kind of lose some information when you project back. So we have applied a sparsity inducing prior on the kernel weight, so actually a lot of them had 0 weight, or at least very close to 0. And yeah, you just kind of lose that. And then when the program that we use to map it just kind of does a mild interpolation across neighboring voxels on the weight. So
why not just keep it in parser space?
Well, just because it's kind of nice to be able to see the distribution of weights across the original primal representation of the data. I mean, what's the, I mean, we could just, I mean, I don't have it here, but yeah, we, also tend to get figures that just have, for each ROI, the weight of that region, but then you're also losing the weights on the samples in the kernel, so it's not really the whole story. But yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think it's a little bit clearer to visualize, and especially, lined up next to the univariate data, you can kind of see, which voxels are pushing the model in which way and how those line up with, the direction of these T or Z statistics.
Could you just explore a little bit the extent of the claims that you're making about what's in the multivariate patterns? So the first statement here is that these multivariate patterns related to successful decisions are conserved across tasks, and this seems to be in some way related to criterion placement, and they do not predict ostensibly the strength of the evidence itself.
Mm-hmm.
Am I to infer, is it an incorrect inference to go from that set of claims to a statement, I'm not sure you're making this, that in fact multivariate patterns in a number of these sort of regions that show retrieval success effects do not carry information about mnemonic strength or perceptual strength? Is that a completely different, you're honing in a particular, you're analyzing the data looking for a particular kind of pattern,
Yeah.
and identifying those patterns that maybe are related to criterion, are unrelated to also existing patterns related to evidence.
Yep.
And you're neutral about the latter, and you're not saying they don't exist, and they may not in fact co-occupy, share populations of voxels, et cetera. Is that fair?
So I mean, I think the stance that we tend to take on this sort of stuff is that, what we think of as the successful retrieval effect, or, in perception the same kind of thing, is that it's a process that's epiphenomenal to, say, the memory trace itself, or the retrieval of the memory itself. So we actually have been kind of trying to figure out good ways of teasing apart mnemonic evidence. And we have some experiments that we're trying to design to help disentangle that from, kind of this, evidence monitoring and strength of evidence. And yeah, I'm definitely not saying that isn't still somewhere in here, because yeah, we just frankly aren't, we're limited to how we're framing the model. Yeah, so I don't think that, we're, saying that doesn't exist, or that that's not in there somewhere. It's just not how we're modeling it. Yeah, that's totally fair to say. Yeah. Yes.
I was just personally wondering about something. You said that you were using money as either a reward or as a punishment to control or manipulate the decision making, like how conservative participants were in their decision making.
Yeah.
And you said it worked very well. And then, I mean, I was just curious about it, whether or not, because the value of money is different across cultures, right? So I was wondering if you were controlling for that, or if you just, had subjects from your university where you knew, well, they all grew up in the Western society here, where the value of money is, higher than in other cultures.
Yeah, I mean, they're UCSB students, so pretty homogeneously white, blonde, maybe like 36 different shades of blonde. But, yeah, so that's, we don't know how that would play out in other cultures. Yeah, we have a admittedly very homogeneous convenience sample from the university. But yeah, I mean, it works well for them. They love money.
Exactly, but yeah, I was curious.
Yeah.
Because I would assume then or expect that they're different.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And yeah, that'd be interesting to check out. We just, yeah. Unfortunately, UCSB does not afford the most diverse samples.
All right, okay, great. Thank you, Tyler.
Thank you.